Right, Spirit Walker, Chapter 8. To avoid meeting the ravens, Torak stayed off the clan paths and kept to the hidden deer trails that wound up the wide water valley. The prey soon sensed that he wasn't hunting them and relaxed. An elk munched willow herb as he passed. Forest horses flicked up their tails and cantered into the trees, then turned to stare till he had gone. 2 boar sows and their fat, fluffy piglets raised their snouts to watch him go by. The new leaves were still crinkled from the bud, and letting in plenty of sunlight. He made good speed. Like all forest people, he travelled light, carrying only what he needed for hunting, fire-making and sleep. All his life he'd wandered the forest with Far, pitching camp for a night or so, then moving on. Always moving on. That had been the hardest part about living with the ravens. They only broke camp every 3 or 4 moons. And there were so many of them. 28 men, women and children, and babies. Until last winter, Torak had never even seen one of those. "Why can't it walk?" he asked Wren. "What does it do all day?" She'd laughed so much she'd fallen over. At the time, that had made him cross. Now it made him miss them all the more. He left the valley of the wide water, south of the Thunder Falls, and headed east into the next valley. There he had a brief encounter with 2 Willow Clan hunters in dugout canoes. To his relief, they were in a hurry and didn't ask where he was going, pausing only to give him a warning before heading downriver. "A sick man escaped from our camp last night," said one. "If you hear howling, run. He doesn't know he's a man anymore." The other shook his head grimly. "This sickness, where did it come from? It's as if the very breath of summer is poisoned." As mid-afternoon wore on, Torak began to feel watched. Many times he stopped to listen, but he never heard anyone, and whenever he doubled back he found nothing. And yet the follower was there. He could sense it. As the shadows lengthened, he pictured madmen roaming the forest, small malevolent creatures with sharp claws and faces of leaves. He pitched camp near a noisy river where the damselflies were blue darts of light, and the midges nearly ate him alive until he rubbed himself with wormwood juice. It was the first time in 6 moons that he'd slept on his own in the forest, and he took care to choose the right spot. Flat ground, high enough above the river to avoid flash floods, and away from ants' nests and obvious prey trails, and no overhanging deadwood or storm-weakened trees to fall on him in the night. After the ravens' reindeer hide shelters, he was keen to get back to the way he'd lived with Far, so he built a shelter of living trees. He found 3 beech saplings and bent them inwards, lashing them together with pine root to make a snug sleeping space. This he thatched with fallen branches and covered with leaf mould, weighing that down with more branches. In the morning he would untie the saplings and they would spring back unharmed. After making a mattress of last autumn's crunchy beech mast, he dragged his gear inside. The shelter had a rich, earthy tang. "A good smell," he said out loud. His voice sounded uneasy and forced. It was a warm night with a southerly breeze, so he made only a small fire, walling it in with stones to stop it escaping into the forest, and waking it up with his strike fire and a handful of birch bark tinder. He remembered nights with Far when they'd sat over the embers, wondering about this mysterious, life-giving creature who was such a good friend to the clans. What did the fire dream of as it slept inside the trees? Where did it go when it died? For the first time, too, he thought of the bonekin he might soon encounter. Maybe with the Red Deer clan he would feel that he belonged. After all, if things had been different, he could have been Red Deer. When he was born, his mother could have named him for her own clan rather than Far's, and then he would have grown up in the deep forest, and Far might not have been killed, and he would never have met Wolf. It was too much to think about. He went off to find food. He dug up some sweet orchid roots and baked them in the embers, and made a hot mash of goosefoot leaves flavoured with crow garlic. It tasted good, but he wasn't hungry. He decided to keep it for day meal. He was hanging his cooking skin in a tree out of the way of foragers when a cry echoed through the forest. He froze. It was not the yowl of a vixen or a lynx seeking a mate. It was a man. or something that had once been a man, far in the west by the sound of it. With a creeping sense of dread, Torak watched the light between the trees begin to fail. Midsummer was not far off, so the night would be brief, just long enough for his spirits to falter. Dusk deepened, and still the forest rang with the chatter of thrushes and the raucous laughter of woodpeckers. The birds would sing all night. He was glad of the company. He thought of the ravens sitting round their long fire, the smell of wood smoke and baked salmon, Oslak's rumbling laugh. The very breath of summer is poisoned. Quickly he unrolled his sleeping sack, crawled in, and laid his weapons by his side. A moment ago he'd been wide awake. Now he was exhausted. He slept. Shrill laughter tore through his dreams. Hazily he became aware of a loud groaning, both familiar and deadly. He was alert in an instant. It was the sound of a falling tree, and it was falling his way. His sleeping sack was twisted round his legs. He couldn't get free. Wriggling like a caterpillar, he squirmed through the entrance hole, struggled to his feet, hopped, fell, narrowly missed the fire, and threw himself sideways into the ferns just as the tree crashed onto the shelter. Sparks shot upwards. Dark branches swayed and came to rest. Torak lay among the ferns, heart pounding, sweat chilling his skin. He checked for storm-weakened trees. He knew he had. Besides, there was hardly any wind. That laughter, malevolent, yet horribly childlike. It hadn't been only his dreams. Not daring to move, he waited till he was sure that nothing else was coming down. Then he went to inspect the ruins of the shelter. A young ash had fallen across it, killing the 3 saplings and trapping his gear inside. With luck he could salvage the gear, which, by firelight at least, appeared undamaged. But if he hadn't woken when he had, he would have been killed. And yet, if the follower had wanted to kill him, why warn him by laughing? It was as if it was playing with him, putting him in danger to see what he would do. The fire was still burning, and with a glowing brand in one hand and his knife in the other, he took a look at the ashtray. He found axe marks, small, crude blows, but effective. That was odd, though. No tracks on the ground, no sign that someone had braced themselves to hack at the tree. Again he swept the ground with firelight. Nothing. Maybe he'd missed something, but he didn't think so. The one thing he knew about was tracking. With his finger he touched the oozing tree blood. It was thickening. That meant the tree trunk had been cut some time before, then pushed over while he slept. He frowned. It's impossible to fell a tree in silence. Why hadn't he heard anything? Then it came to him. He'd filled his water skin at the river, which had drowned out other sounds. As he stood there amid the dark and dying trees, he wished Wolf was with him. Nothing would get past Wolf. His ears were so keen that he could hear the clouds pass. His nose was so sharp that he could smell the breath of a fish. But Wolf isn't here, Torak told himself savagely. He's far away on the mountain. For the first time in 6 moons, he couldn't howl for his lost friend. He didn't like to think of who or what might answer his call. It was past middle night by the time he'd salvaged his gear and built another shelter, and he was numb with fatigue. He was also uneasily aware that he'd caused the deaths of 3 saplings. He could feel their souls hanging in the air around him, wistful, bewildered, unable to understand why they'd been robbed of their chance of becoming trees. "It's your fault," the older trees seemed to whisper. "You bring evil with you." This time he didn't risk getting into his sleeping sack. Instead, he woke the fire and sat in his new shelter with the reindeer hide around his shoulders and his axe on his knees. He didn't want sleep. He just wanted dawn to come. Wait for part 2.